What is a philosophical device that you can use to absolutely cut through conspiracy theories? Well, we're going to talk about it today on the Tonic podcast. Hello, everyone. I am Drew, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Alex. How you doing, Alex?
What's up, man? I'm doing pretty well. It's like 90 degrees today in Spain, so I'm hiding in the basement in the shade and cool.
Very nice. Yeah, me too. It's getting a little warm out here in California, and I'm staying cool with some AC, and it's pretty nice. But I wanted to get into today is conspiracy theories and perhaps conspiracy theories' biggest enemy, which is the idea of Occam's razor. Super fun to talk about. Always a joy to talk about conspiracy theories, whether they're whether they're founded in reality or not. And this is one thing that always comes up when you do talk about conspiracy theories. As you get more and more complex of a theory, you're more likely to run into this issue of Occam's razor. So let's get into what it is. It's also known as the law of parsimony. It's that entities should not be multiplied without necessity. Another more colloquial way to put this idea is that the simplest explanation is most commonly the correct one. So let's go into a little bit of history. It came from an English Franciscan friar named William of Occam, right? That's the town in which he was a friar in. And he was not the first to kind of have this idea, but he was one of the first to kind of quote it and have that quote be then, multiplied and kind of be the guy, the face of the idea for a while. And it's a heuristic principle. It's a tool of knowledge, but it's not like a hard fact and a hard theory, right? You can't test Occam's razor 100% correctly all the time, and we'll get into why and maybe different examples. But it's a method of learning that can help you explain things and maybe get to the best explanation without spending too much time or perhaps going down the wrong route that leads to conspiracy theories. So off the bat, what are your thoughts of Occam's razor, and have you ever had this happen to you where you've kind of utilized this heuristic device and found the correct answer?
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, when you get to philosophy, correct answer, I don't know if I could say correct, but I think it does help you kind of siphon down the proper response, I guess you could say. And there's one example I'm going to get to later when we kind of more dive into actual theories. But no, I think Occam's razor is an interesting measure to kind of help you break down some of the assumptions that are linked with anything, really, not just conspiracies, but just kind of the jargon, because it is true that with a lot of information, the more assumptions you have to kind of grasp for, I think the more hard it is to not only prove something, but to really find something feasible.
Right.
Simplicity usually isn't always the best, but it's always the most provable. And like the example I saw on philosophy.com, which I thought was sort of funny, was that they give the example of a fence. They say one of your fences is broken. There are two possible explanations. A, an albino moose crashed through the fence in despair and broke it. Or B, an old nail rusted through. B is obviously the better answer because There's a lot less assumptions, right? Like you would have to assume A, that there's an albino mouse near your fence. B, you would have to assume that it's lonely. C, you would have to assume that it could even break the fence. Like there's just a lot of issues with that, right? But the simpler one is that, the fence is probably just old and had an issue. And to kind of link that to conspiracy theories, I find that not all conspiracy theories are created equally.
Sure, certainly not.
I think the implausible ones are the ones that draw on a lot of assumptions that probably aren't always feasible, while the ones that could actually be true usually are quite simple. So I don't know what your thoughts on that are, but yeah, that's kind of where I would go from there.
Yeah, I mean, look, just so let's go to the extremes for the sake of understanding, right? The flat Earth theory. Okay, the idea that in modern day, and there is a real movement of people that believe that the Earth is flat, and not only do they believe that the Earth is flat, but that they believe that it is a large scale global coordinated conspiracy to then convince the people that the Earth is round and that space is real, when in reality the Earth is flat. So NASA, the U.S. government, the Indians, whatever, India's space agency, China's space agency, all the space agencies of the world have then agreed upon to then provide disinformation that the Earth is round when in actuality it is flat. There are so many steps and so many we talk about these assumptions that you have to have on top of each other that it's pretty much impossible that the Earth is flat, or that conspiracy is real, right? Occam's razor would absolutely tear the flat Earth. I mean, outside of space agencies, you got to think about geologists, right? People that study the actual foundations of the Earth, people that study earthquake movements through the tectonic plates, all suggest a round globe Earth. But you would then have to extend that conspiracy. Oh, well, then all of the whole geologist community is in on it too. The whole earthquake science is in on it too. And it's just so many steps that it's, well, Occam's razor would say, no. Cut all the fat. Cut all the fat. It is absolutely more likely that science has just led us to the conclusion that the Earth is a globe. There's not a conspiracy for the flat Earth, right? So that's an obvious, extreme example that I think most people that are listening would understand. Okay, yeah, wow, that's crazy. But it's not just about, the simplicity is the answer. It's about what you said. I think you mentioned earlier. It's simplicity is the most testable. Because again, parsimony and this law of parsimony is not a theory or a commandment or a substitute for a fleshed out explanation. If you do have a complex explanation, but it's backed up by empirical evidence for every single step, then that doesn't mean you just go for the simpler answer. You still have to go with the complex answers if they're backed up by evidence. So, Albert Einstein is attributed to quoting, it's not, I don't think it's 100% sure that he said this, but it's thrown around that he said this, that make everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I think that was interesting because it's like, you don't want to oversimplifize for the sake of doing so, but you do want to just make sure that you're using Occam's razor as a learning tool to find the best and most testable answer, which I think is the key part.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point, and it also goes back to, because you mentioned William of Occam, who was kind of the modern, postulator of this theory. But then I like what Aristotle was actually quoted saying too, where he said, let's see here, fewer postulates or hypotheses. So he said, other things being equal, we should prefer a demonstration which derives from fewer postulates or hypotheses. And basically this means that proof is more convincing if it makes fewer guesses. And I think that goes exactly with what you said that Einstein might have said, where don't make it simpler. Like, you're not trying to just guess vaguely and simplify something beyond repair, but you need to have evidence or facts or at least hypotheses that are provable, not just,
right,
extraneous ideas. And kind of now getting into, conspiracy theories, I think that that's the issue with some of these, is that they just rely on so many swinging pieces and moving pieces that it's impossible. Like, this is kind of a joke one, but I think both of us have probably watched the show Ancient Aliens, right?
Yeah, for fun. Yeah, just kind of, yeah.
It's a funny show, and like the hypothesis, who built the pyramids? I mean, solution A is that humans have been building structures for thousands and thousands of years, so they probably built the pyramids. Or solution B is aliens built them, but they were able to come to Earth. Plus, they were interested in humanity. Plus, they had the technology. Plus, they haven't been discovered. It just goes on, right, and on and on. And,
right.
And so that would be an easy one. I think it gets tougher, though, sometimes when you get into stuff like maybe atheism versus theism or something, where there's no starting block for either side, where, something like that, where creation and existence. But I think for the more concrete things, I think Occam's razor can at least be easy in, kind of just siphoning through the BS.
Well, what's interesting is you mentioned the creation versus intelligent design versus the Big Bang theory of random happenstance and scientific order. That's an interesting, that there are instances where both sides of an argument almost co-opt the idea of Occam's razor. And right, especially when you do get to these grand philosophical and almost metaphysical level of discussion, it does get difficult because, we're kind of getting off the bounds of politics, but, screw it. This is fun. If you're talking about creation and the Big Bang, one side could say, look, Occam's razor would tell us the simplistic thing is not to trust a supernatural source. It would just have to be the forces of nature that we can observe. That's one way to interpret it. Now, however, the other side would say nature and the organization of our universe is so complex that Occam's razor would lead us to believe that it must be a designer. The simplest answer would be that this super complex universe would be designed. So it's just important to remember that there's instances where Occam's razor can be used as a philosophical tool on both sides. And who am I to say which is right, creation or Big Bang? I'm certainly not here to point one way or another, and I'm sure our listeners have all sorts of different opinions on that. But my point is that Occam's razor as a heuristic tool can be used in both sides of an argument, and it can, simplicity is kind of subjective, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
it's almost like beauty or I don't know, like, it can be interpreted subjectively, right? So, like, that exact idea, like, oh, a designer created this complex world is a simplistic method to understand it. But an atheist would say, no, that's not simplistic at all, because you're adding a supernatural input.
Yeah, and I don't want to spend too much time on the coronavirus, but the interesting thing is what you just said there is how simplicity can be difficult and can be very subjective is actually one of the main reasons that surrounds kind of this Wuhan lab theory, that the virus either came from a lab or was created in a lab. Because people like myself would say that Occam's razor, it's very clear that this virus came from nature, mainly because coronaviruses have come from nature before, and we've found a virus similar to this in bats in nature. So to me, there's less assumptions in that. But now Peter Navarro, one of Trump's economic advisors, has actually been quoted saying, if you look at Occam's razor, the obvious solution is that this probably did come from a lab. And so you've seen two complete sides using, simplicity says this, and that's where it gets complicated, like you said, because and it's true, like, what is simpler, that someone was experimenting on a new virus and it got out, or it came naturally from a bat? I mean, I think it's becoming provable that it did come from nature, but still, that's where you muddle the waters.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a very good real world example, more politically based. Of that problem where you can have both sides of an argument kind of co-opt Occam's razor, and it's hard to know which side is more convincing. I think we have to remember, though, that Occam's razor is used as a tool for learning and not as a tool for coming to a conclusion. It is not. It is not saying it, like the Wuhan thing, right? What it means is, the more likely thing is that it came from nature, and that needs to lead me down the path of testing that hypothesis. What things can we do to test that idea that it came from nature, right? And I certainly don't know enough about virology or biology to give that, but I'm sure there are experts that are. But we have to remember that Occam's razor is then used as a tool to go down the testing route, right? It's used as, okay, well, where do I start testing? Where do I think my hypothesis should lead? It's not saying I'm going to think about Occam's razor as what's the most simple, and then I'm just going to stop there and come to my conclusion and not test it, right? So, when Robert Navarro says Occam's razor leads us to believe it's made in a lab, okay, so let's go down that road. Where's the empirical evidence? Right, it has to then go down the road of these assumptions and claims have to be backed up by evidence.
Exactly. Well said. And unfortunately, though, like, I mean, even on that one, like, then you could get into a rabbit hole, though, where they could say, well, actually, there's been many labs around the world that have been studying coronaviruses,
sure.
Blah 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 blah.
Yep.
And so, like, that's why this one, especially in this time of misinformation, I think that's why also, I mean, unfortunately, I'm going to stay on the coronavirus for this next one, is the Bill Gates conspiracies that I see going around right now, where, he's trying to make money off of a vaccine, and, it's kind of a globalist, ploy to track people and all this BS. But again, if you use Occam's razor, I actually think it would invalidate that conspiracy. Because you would have to assume Bill Gates wants to make money off of a vaccine, A, which he doesn't need any more money. B, you would have to assume that he has, sinister intentions, which his history does not show with his record in Africa.
Right.
And, you could just go down this one where I think it would invalidate that. So I think you're right that it is at least a good means of coming to a logical conclusion, even if simplicity isn't always the answer. I think it at least incites a logical discussion, if we can even have those anymore.
Absolutely. No, I think Occam's razor is a very valuable tool of learning and understanding and starting the process of beginning to hypothesize and go down a road. I absolutely think it's valuable. It's just like any kind of philosophical device or also like rhetorical device, right? It can be used in good faith and it can also be used in bad faith. And I think we just have to be aware of when people are using Occam's razor in bad faith, right? Another example would be, has the government ever lied to you before? Yes. Okay. We can point at examples. So then Occam's razor would say, then it has to be lying to you now. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? So, I can see how it's just, we need to be aware that there are conspiracy theorists that have kind of co-opted this tool in almost, and I think almost a hypocritical way. And we just have to be aware of that. But yeah, like the Bill Gates thing is a perfect example of, you would have to, all these assumptions then are compounding on each other. Yeah, like you said, Bill Gates would have to be, have malintent, want to make more money even though he's gives all of it away. He would then, the whole thing about like vaccines, he tried to make autism in Africa. Okay, so one, you'd have to, vaccines cause autism. That's a first assumption that we don't think is true. Then you have to imagine that he wants to give autism to African kids. That's another assumption. Then the other assumption is that he got away with it and no governments or medical doctors were warning anyone about this. Like, there's so many assumptions on top of this Bill Gates thing that it's, I think it's unbelievably unlikely that Bill Gates is purposely trying to vaccinate people for profit or give autism out, it's just ridiculous, right? Because Occam's razor would tell us more likely he's a philanthropic billionaire that cares about health.
Yeah, and completely. And his track record definitely says
his
that.
Track
not
record,
the contrary.
And the empirical evidence points to that as well.
Exactly. Now, there's an interesting example. I was kind of just thinking out on the spot here while we were talking, is that I think there's an interesting example in the last 50 years where Occam's razor maybe almost backfired a little bit. And not in the way because the logic didn't work, but you'll hear where I'm going, is that Kennedy's assassination, I think, is an interesting one with Occam's razor. Like, the simplest solution in that is that he was killed by Oswald, who was a rogue agent, just a crazy, disgruntled socialist. And most studies say, and most reports do say, that he was a lone man on his own doing this.
Right.
And it was almost that simplicity that almost has driven people to believe that there is something bigger because of what they call the proportionality bias,
Right.
which is kind of our innate tendency to assume that something small can't happen without a bigger picture, right? A bigger motive, a bigger apparatus. And I think that is why so many people want to believe that, the CIA or the KGB or this, whatever third party helped this happen, because people don't want to believe the simplest factor. And I'm a victim of it too. Maybe
Sure.
not with Kennedy, but with other things. It seems almost lame. Like, part of our existence is looking for the bigger picture,
Right. Well, that's another point too. It is, we also have to understand why people start to believe these conspiracy theories in the first place. And you had linked that great article from the Time magazine that, why do so many people believe conspiracy theories? They mentioned JFK, of people didn't want to accept that it was just a guy with a gun. They didn't want to accept the fact that a disgruntled dude could just get a gun and kill a beloved president. People wanted to think, it must be the Russians, or it must be the CIA, or it must be the mafia, right? Because sometimes we don't want to accept kind of like the buck stops at something unsatisfying. Same thing with the ancient aliens guys, right? It's not as fun. It's not as fun to just be like, you know what, man, I think maybe the Egyptians just they used slave labor to build giant pyramids for the pharaohs because the pharaohs had giant egos. And once they did that, then that's it. There was no energy source. There's no lining with the stars. It was just pharaohs that wanted to die in a big tomb, and they made people make it for them. That's not as sexy and fun as aliens came down to select energy pyramid sources, So I think one, it's a desire to have a more interesting world, whether that's subconscious or not. It's a fear that random bad things can just happen, right? You'll see, it's a victimization problem, right? I can't be disenfranchised because of just the way the world is. It has to be the government purposely keeping me down, or my representation in government is not because I democratically lost. It's because of a deep state or something. That people don't want to accept the reality, because sometimes the reality is just either boring, mundane, or it's no one's fault, right? The problem is, sometimes, pardon my French, but sometimes shit just happens. And I think sometimes people want to make sure that there's a person behind it, someone to blame, and conspiracy theories often take off from that when maybe there's no one to blame.
Very well said. And I think that goes perfectly into, I believe it was still the Times article
Yeah.
where they were talking about the most common times that conspiracies come out in politics, at least, are from the losers.
Right.
The Joseph Uskinski, I think it is, Joseph Uskinski said conspiracy theories are for losers. And it is actually fascinating that whatever party is not in power, typically, at least in the United States, I'm not as versed on conspiracies in, say, Russia or something, but at least in the United States, I mean, let's think about like just the Obama birth certificate conspiracy.
Right.
That came out of a period where where the right was very irritated with the Obama administration and was kind of willing to go out on a limb to maybe hope that there was something bigger and something worse than just the president that they didn't like. And, the same, I mean, in some ways, and this is debatable, could be said about, during Trump's time, the want to have him connected with Russia. Right. Or George W. Bush during the time, the masterminding of the Iraq war, which, I mean, some of that has come, I'm not going to say totally true, but there are pieces there, or that 9/11 was an inside job. It seems to come out of times when we have political division and the losers are angry. And
yes,
you saw that especially with people like Alex Jones during Obama, right? Like everything was some big globalist conspiracy. And it's kind of fascinating to me to see that happen now. And sometimes it's warranted. I mean, during the Cold War, I think conspiracies being true actually had a pretty good track record.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, like the incredible does happen, right? It's not just like, oh, we live in a simple world and nothing complex happens. Like the incredible and complex absolutely does happen. But again, it's that like we get to those conclusions because it's backed up by empirical evidence. Like we have empirical evidence that the United States was engaged in a massive surveillance project, even of our allies, right? Something that would have been considered a conspiracy in 1999, evidence started to come out, and then it actually became the most simple answer in by 2012 with Edward Snowden and everything. And now it is, right? We've gone from no, it's too conspiratorial that you'd have the government spying on my webcam in my house, that's crazy, to now we're at the point of I assume they are. We have an understanding that China and the United States, it's like, that's the simplest answer, is that government spy using technology. So absolutely things change, but it's still behind that idea of like empirical evidence comes out to then change, like, complex things do happen. But certainly back to your point about the losers, right? The political losers are definitely become more conspiratorial. Absolutely. I mean, look at what one good point was Trump, right? We do know that there were some bad actors in his campaign that had ties with Russia, but we also have come to the conclusion that the idea that Trump is Putin's lackey and does Putin's bidding, that's not true. There's not a conspiracy that Trump is honestly like Putin's lapdog. I don't think there's no evidence to get to that point. And, we've seen that. Same thing with Bernie, right? Bernie bros, Hillary Clinton wins nominations by winning votes, and Bernie bros, claim there's a conspiracy. Now there's definitely weird things, right? About, maybe CNN giving Clinton debates questions beforehand.